So I'm glad that this talk is so popular. I guess we should have chosen a larger venue. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited today to have Dr. Ivo Pirisi with us. Before I turn the time over to him, though, a couple of plugs. One, thank you to the Gerontology program, the Department of Psychology, and the Neuroscience Center for funding Dr. Pirisi's presentation. So let's give them a hand. A note about the Gerontology program. So Gerontology offers is it a minor now? So you can minor in Gerontology if this is something that interests you. We have some flyers up here for the Gerontology program. Pick one of those up on the way out. I know that there may be a small tasting on the way out, so if you can stick around to the end of the program, there may be some stinky goat cheese in it for you. It's pretty fantastic, actually. And the olive oil was, no, it's not stinky goat cheese, it's olive oil and some of the traditional Sardinian bread, which Dr. Pirisi will tell us about. The olive oil was pressed 3 days ago?
Yeah, 3 days.
Yeah, 3 days ago. So it's fresh. It's really good. Another note, a plug for the, what are we calling this year? Society Behavior and Health Study Abroad being run by Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstedt. So the way that we met Ivo was through a study abroad. Some of the study abroad students are here. It's a life-changing experience, right? So if you're interested in doing this and going to Sardinia and learning more about Blue Zones, you can apply for the study abroad. It's happening next July, 29th of June through the 29th of July. Go to kennedy.byu.edu, search for BRAIN, is actually how I searched for this, or Society and Behavior. Applications are being accepted now. They're only taking 15 students next year. So if you're interested, apply now. Anything else you want to say about that? Okay. So Dr. Pirisi is potentially the most interesting man in the world. He has a PhD in biology from the University of Cagliari. He has an amazing photography blog. He's going to show us some of his photos a little bit later on. He rides a motorcycle. He cooks. He is much more. He does Ironman. He's much more interesting than me. So I'm going to turn the time over to him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pirisi.
It's an honor to be here, firstly. Thanks for inviting me over. I didn't expect you so numerous, so I'm very excited about it. I wanted to start with an information first. Then I'll say a few things about me, since I'm not famous yet, and most of you know nothing about me. When you let the mice eat as much as they want, they live an average of 780 days, which corresponds to 78 years of a human being. If you reduce their food intake by the 40%, they live an average of 970 days, which corresponds to 97 years for humans, which is like gaining 19 years of our lives. We will step back to this concept later during the talk. Just a few things about me. I was born in the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, in a tiny village in the center of the island. When I say tiny, I mean it, with only 500 people, 500 inhabitants living over there. And when I was 18, I moved then in Cagliari, where I enrolled to myself to the university. I got a degree in biology, and I specialized in genetics. Then I had the lucky chance to have the possibility to work as a researcher for the same university, and I worked 5 years. I studied metabolism. At that time, we were studying a gene, which is called VGF, and just few things were known at that time. We just knew that taking away that gene from the mice genome the mice could have fed themselves relentlessly, but without gaining any fat. So they would have fed themselves eagerly, but they couldn't gain any fat. So it was a very striking and interesting thing, and I just studied that gene for those years. Then the work was later published. But since I realized those years that I was doing the same life of the mice we were studying, I decided to throw everything away, and I changed completely my line, switching to photography. From the very beginning, which was actually my real passion. From the very beginning, I started with a photographic project, who was involved mainly in taking pictures about the centenarians, because already at that time there was a lot of talk about it, and that brought me acquaintances, and especially I get in touch with a magazine from Israel who was interested in realizing and doing a series of articles on longevity. So they came over, and I worked with them for a few months on assignment. They were quite satisfied about that work, so I had the possibility to move to Israel under the same assignment to do the same task. Since then, I met Professor Ophir Vogel from Israel, who's one of the most important researchers and pathologists, natural pathologists of Israel, and one of the most experts in the longevity theme. And we started to organize trips which were based on science in a way, and then all the results that were published in the scientific papers were just transformed in a way into an experience. So, just to give you an example, we would have made a lot of boring science talking about the omega-3 fatty acids, for instance, in the pecorino cheese, and then we would have spent a whole day with the shepherd learning how to milk, making cheese, and transforming what science said into an experience. This is actually what brought me here, because this is what we did for your university in July, and that's it. That's how I ended up here. Luckily for me, I was invited to have this talk. So they were, excuse me, they were so interested in knowing and understanding a little bit more about the blue zones. Now, what does blue zone mean? In the late 90s, an important professor from the University of Sassari, which is a city in the northern side of Sardinia, Professor Gianni Pes, who is a medic and a statistician, was wandering around through the island and marking down with a blue pen the number of the centenarians he would have met in every single municipality, because we have 377 different municipalities on the island. At a certain point, he found himself with a patch drawn on the map because of the high concentration of centenarians in a particular area of the region, so in a particular area of the map. Since then, the blue zone was applied for describing those places in the world with a higher concentration of centenarians related with the average, related with the normal population. So longevity, in a way, it's aging. It's the capability of reaching certain ages. But the scientists and the general people as well is not that much interested in knowing that we are capable of reaching 110, for instance. But we are mainly interested, and the scientific community is mainly interested in understanding under what conditions we arrive at certain ages. Mental conditions, physical conditions. I'm talking about the quality of the life. That's what matters. So, under this new perspective, we could reconsider again the blue zones, not as places where simply you have this astonishing data, but like places where something happened, where it's the cultural system that has to be understood, because it's a kind of a recipe that could be different in different places, because the cultures are different, and a culture is made of habits, customs. It is completely mixed up with traditions, or it depends on the contaminations brought in by other people. So, for understanding, in my view, for understanding a blue zone, I forgot to mention that Sardinia is just one of the 5 officially recognized blue zones in the world. Because as you've seen, we have the one in Sardinia, then we have another one which is a tiny island in Greece, in Caria. Nicoya, it's a peninsula in Costa Rica. Okinawa, it's an island in Japan. And Loma Linda, it's a very small community living in California, so you have your own. Actually, they get older and older because it's a religious community. It's a Seventh-day religious community. I don't know if you've ever heard about them. Anyway, I was saying that in order to understand the Sardinian blue zone, as well as the other blue zones, if we need to understand the cultural issues, we need to talk, to mention at least the roots that made it possible. And to talk about the roots of Sardinia, we need to step back to 14,000 years ago, where it seems that first settlers arrived to the island. At that time, or even before, 18,000 years ago, it was in Europe, at that time was the last ice age. It was only in 2 refuges that the life was possible because of the harsh climate. And it seems that these 2 people, one here on the Iberic Peninsula and the other one on the right in the Balkanic area, started to move eastward and westward as soon as the weather started to improve and as soon as the ice started to retreat. Anyhow, thanks to an important research led by Dr. Paolo Francalacci, we have understood that the first settlers arrived making their way through southern France and passing through the Alps and arriving lately in Tuscany. And at a certain point, also because 14,000 years ago, because of the ice age, the sea levels were lower. So you did have natural bridges that linked the emerged islands. They made their way through Sardinia. It's interesting to notice that the M24 genetic marker, because we understood that those people arrived in Sardinia thanks to a genetic marker, which was carried by the Y chromosome, which is then passed down from generation to generation through the male lineage. Thanks to that genetic marker, we know that the M24 people, we can call it like that, are massively present in Sardinia and are rare or almost absent in the rest of Europe. So it's an ancient population, and we just find few traces in the Iberic Peninsula from where presumably they left a long time ago. You need to know also that at a certain point Sardinia has been just kicked around like a rugby balloon because of the interest it had, because of the riches, because of the soil, and because of the strategic location it had in the center of the Mediterranean. So all the Mediterranean powers at a certain point, even in ancient times, started to turn interested in it, and we had then Phoenicians arriving from the Lebanon coasts, we had the Carthaginians, we had the Romans, we had the Vandals, we had the Byzantines, and then we had the Pisans and the Catalonians, the Aragonese, the Spanish crown when it merged, the Piedmontese. It's a very complicated history, the one we had. But most interestingly, still we find today people in the blue zone area carrying the 35% of the genes. I mean, in other terms, the 35% of the people over there is still having this genetic marker. So that means that that wave of different people was mainly a cultural one, more than a genetic one. This is very important for understanding in depth the talk that we are doing today. Also because with all these people trying to plunder, to loot the island, to conquer it, to exploit it, the Sardinians at a certain point retreated inward, and they kind of developed in a way a sense of wariness and even disdain against the conquerors. It's like if the newcomers for us, for Sardinians, have always meant subjugation and exploitation. And this is also important because in a way we turned inward, establishing very important bounds, especially inside the families. We were forced to do that. And also within the communities, even the families started to link to each other. It was the only way to protect ourselves against the invaders in a way. And again, it has made things very peculiar because in these communities were so isolated that they were turned into comfortable places, comfortable when it comes to talk about genetics. So genetically comfortable means that it was easy to find a partner inside these communities because there was not any external genetic flow. And this is extremely important because it's like if our self-isolation has worked as a genetic incubator. So amplifying certain traits and subduing others. And of course, among the traits which were amplified, we have positive ones and negative ones. Just to make an example, among the positive ones, we have smaller blood cells compared with the average of the people. It makes us more resilient against malaria, so it's positive, and also it lessens the chances to get blood clots. And again, it's a positive trait. But we have also negative ones. For instance, we have one of the highest rates of type 1 diabetes in the world, because that trait, it seems that was kept inside the genetic pool of those communities which were so isolated. And again, we have one of the highest rates of multiple sclerosis in the world. And again, that one too, together with the life expectancy, which is a positive one, was kept inside the genetic pool. So, after the economic boom that even in those places experienced in the 50s and the 60s after World War II, the general condition improved. The hygienic one, or for instance, they brought in the vaccination and the antibiotics. They paved the roads. They brought in new jobs. So it was just at that time that the genes that we have talked about, the environment, and the general situation could work all together in order to make the magic and to give birth to the Sardinian blue zone. So these are, I just mentioned a few things about the routes. But let's discuss in detail right now the Sardinia Blue Zone, digging out the numbers. You should know that among 70,865 people that was born between 1890 and the 1900s, we had 91 centenarians. That means one every 196 people that were born during that spell of time. It's amazing to consider that this ratio exceeds the one of the US by a factor of 30, so it's 30 times more. Most interestingly, most interestingly, and what makes the Sardinia Blue Zone different from the others is this one, that the work ratio between men and women is 1 to 4. What does it mean? It means that average is, in the rest of the world, 1 man centenarian and 4 women. In some places, for instance, like in the United States, it is 1 to 5 in favor of the women. In other places, like in Japan, it's 1 to 7 in favor of the women. The Sardinian ratio is just different. It's 1 to 1. It's 1 to 1. It's the only place in the world where the men live as much as the women. In some tiny communities, the men outlive the women. You'll see, you'll learn about it. But I want to add also something else which is important. And I have brought with me the data of the 2016, where the total centenaries in Sardinia were 468 for a population of 1,656,000, which more or less is 1 every, let's say, 3,500 people. More or less, 1 every 3,500 people is the same rate that we have in mainland, that we have in Italy. So Sardinia, this is another important aspect. Sardinia, taken as a whole, it's not a blue zone at all. It's only a particular spot of Sardinia. It's a cluster of villages where you can have this phenomenon. In Seulo, which is right in the middle of the blue zone, Seulo is a very small village with just 900 inhabitants living over there. Considering the people who were born between 1868 to 1926, I want to add that in 1868 the civil registers of Italy were started by the government. So since then we can work on the data because those data are considered to be reliable. We had in that spell of time 20 centenarians, which is 1% of the people who were born in those years turned 100. That it is incredible. And among these 20 centenarians, 9 were female and 11 male. So it's one of the few cases where the men outlived the women. Again, some more data about it. The 70% of the people who were born during that time overcame the 19-year-old of life. And among them, because they were 311, 56 are still around. So we have in that village, which is a very small village, we have roughly 60 people. It's a wave of people who's arriving to 100. That is very, very incredible. I want to talk about now. About what makes the Sardinia Blue Zone so unique, which is the rate of male centenarian compared to the women one. And to do that, I will talk about an important paper that was published in 2006 by Dr. Janipes, where they made a very considerable research studying several variables, like, for instance, the consumption of the barley, the consumption of the wheat, the job, the distance from the working place, the steepness of the place where these guys lived, or again the consumption of wine. Several variables were studied, and through a statistical algorithm, they established some positive correlations with longevity. It's nice to observe that they were able to establish some positive correlations with the consumption of the barley, the consumption of red wine, the distance from the working place, and the job. And the job one was one of the most important ones statistically. You need to know that at that time, because we are talking about because the people who today is 100 was born in first years of the past century. So we are talking about the years, the 30s and the 40s, and during those years, in those villages up in the mountains, 90 or even more people in the village were working as shepherds. And most likely because of the lay of the land and because the place is pristine and unpenetrable and rugged, they could have pastured goats instead of sheep, because the terrain was more suitable for that, for herding goats. And it seems that according to most of the anthropologists and researchers, it seems that we need to understand that aspect in order to understand why the men outlive the women. I'll give you an example. At that time, the shepherds were forced to leave their communities for 6 months, because during winter, the general conditions, because of the climate, were not suitable for the flocks. So they would have moved for 6 months, and they would have brought with them this kind of bread, but we will talk about it later. This is considered bread of the shepherds of the Blue Zone, which is called the pane carazao. And they would have brought this one, because this one lasts ages. So the wives would have prepared for them the bread for 6 months, and they would have left with their horses and the saddlebags filled with that bread for 6 months. Living in the open side, walking a lot, eating properly, having a very lean diet, and leading in a way a stress-free lifestyle, in a way. On the other hand, the women would have waited for them in the communities, isolated, burdened by all the tasks they had, especially the economic ones, because the economy in those families was led by the women. I'm not entirely, I don't agree entirely, but according to many, the Sardinian society has a matriarchate. How do you say it? Matriarchal. It's a matriarchal society. So all these tasks were just left to the women, and it seems that played an important role in the aging, because the women do not age like the men. This is proposed like one of the reasons why we have in a way the same rate of male centenarians and female centenarians. Generally, when we talk about blue zones, especially for the Sardinian one, we resume the longevity key factors, and they are known for being the genetics that we have already discussed at the beginning in a way, strong families and communities, and we mentioned that, physical activity, so the importance of walking that much, and we talked about the Sardinian shepherds, and we have a variety of studies who talk about that too, proving that because of the terrain, their hikings in a way consume as much as 490 calories per hour, and they used to walk even more than 7 or 8 miles per day. So you will understand the importance of the physical activity. Another thing to mention is the personality. Because the Sardinian men are famous for having a very peculiar personality. They don't care too much about things. They are not so stressed. They have a very interesting temperament. They are always ready to laugh with friends, to tease among each other. It is something that really belongs to Sardinians. And again, the last one is the diet, which in a way is one of the most important ones, because of course if you are blessed with your genes, it's good for you, but we can do nothing about it. But in the diet, still our choices can make the difference. We have the possibility to intervene with our choices, especially when it comes to talk about the eating behavior. So I wanna talk a little bit more thoroughly about the diet. I interviewed dozens and dozens of centenarians myself, and I collected a lot of data, even if it's not always easy in a way to track back precise and reliable data, because you are interacting with people whose memory is fading a little bit, if you want. So sometimes you need to build your researches on previous studies that were done in the 30s and in the 40s. That is one of the main sources of data when we are talking about the eating behavior, the behavior referred to that period. I would like you to imagine in a way what was the staple diet of that time. And they could have had vegetables. Even in the morning they would have had, for instance, a very simple breakfast with some fruit, and then once in the open, in the countryside, they would have eaten bread and cheese, and then they would have had bread and onions or vegetables at lunch, and obligatory at night they would have had the minestrone, which is so famous, which is a Sardinian vegetable soup. So simple, but with a variety of seasonal and locally grown produce. That makes the difference. Sometimes during winter it was even flavored with some lard, which is not considered to be healthy in a way. And the summer version would have been lighter. So this is just to give you an idea about what could have been an example of a diet of one of these shepherds. So mainly they had vegetables, legumes daily, bread, cheese, meat, even if the meat and the consumption of meat was just reduced to once a week. And so we can define this kind of diet as a very lean, as a very frugal, plant-based diet, which was, as I told you before, only accented with a little meat. I want to describe even more thoroughly what kind of vegetables and other macronutrients they were having. For instance, the vegetables, they had many kinds, as zucchini, eggplants, carrots, artichokes, that are very considered to be important because they protect the liver. Potatoes for sure, beets, lettuce, radish, and celery. But sometimes, and this is important, they foraged some vegetables in the countries. I remember clearly that when I interviewed them, sometimes when I asked them, what did you have during your youth? What did you eat when you were young? They replied, "Oh, we didn't eat. We were pasturing." And it's not a coincidence that a lot of centenarians gave me that answer. We were pasturing. We were pasturing means, in a way, that they were like animals. They were eating whatever was available in the countryside. So, for instance, wild chicory, or wild beets, wild artichokes, wild thistle, that is considered to be very, very important in the Sardinian blue zone diet. But again, asparagus and mushrooms, they were collecting and foraging any kind of sort of vegetables that were available in that season. Something that is considered to be very important as a source of proteins are the legumes, being the main one, the fava beans, the broad beans. And again, the chickpeas, the lentils, the chickling peas, and the beans themselves. They were consumed daily, mainly with the minestrone soup that I mentioned before. Fruits, of course, a variety every day, seasonal, not like today that we import fruits from different parts of the world. It seems that it's not healthy for us to do that. And again, grains, whole durum wheat, and barley. The scientists have always tried to understand why some places, like my own village, which is called Escolca, which is right at the border of the blue zone, do not have those numbers. So they are trying to analyze and dig in the very faint details in their diets, in a way, in order to understand what could have played an important role. Because in places like in Seul, which is just 20 kilometers as the crow flies, they've had 20 centenarians in 40 years, and we had just one. And the consumption of the barley is one of those, because in the real blue zone, up in the mountains, the consumption of the barley and the wheat was quite the same. They used to the consumption of the wheat was 50%, the consumption of the barley was 50%. And the same is true for the bread made with wheat or made with barley. Of course, we are talking about whole wheat flours, the refined flours, which from many are considered to be the plague of our times, didn't exist at that time. Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's like poison, because they raise your levels of glucose in the blood, and then it's a mess. But it's complicated. And again, they had a variety of they eat a variety of seeds like walnuts, almonds, chestnuts, and peanuts. Oils like olive oil. In some places also the mastic oil. I know that you are not familiar with the mastic bush, that it's not present. Do you remember about that bush? Anyway, it is present in the Mediterranean shrubbery, and it has these small berries. And in the past, when not everyone could afford the consumption of olive oil, because it was considered to be a treasure at that time, even nowadays it's considered to be a treasure, they could have implemented their diets with the mastic oil, with the usage of the mastic oil for seasoning the food. And it seems that it has a very high concentration of antioxidants. As I told you before, little meat. And what is very interesting, they didn't eat fish. So the Sardinian diet, even if we are right in the center of the Mediterranean, it is not considered to be a Mediterranean diet. because the cornerstone of the Mediterranean diet is the fish. But the generation of my father doesn't know how to swim, and they hate the seaside. It's something that we have in our genes because, as I told you before, we were scared by the sea because the sea has always brought in problems and conquerors, and it was a mess arriving from there. So we have developed that kind of feeling against the seaside. And in the center of the island, but even in the rest of the island until the 50s, because until the 50s no one was able to even to fish. No one was implementing its diet with fish, because the omega-3 fatty acids were taken mainly from the seeds, from the walnuts, from the almonds. It's true that that the consumption of the meat was quite rare, but also the quality of the meat was completely different, because we are talking about free-range meat and grass-fed. And when the meat is free-range, when the cattle is free-range, and when it is grass-fed, the content of omega-3s are better. The proportion between the omega-3s and the omega-6 is favorable. So that played an important role. The quality also of the meat they had access to. And again, they implemented their diets with a lot of game meat. So a leaner meat, if you want, almost without any fat, and with the proportion of omega-3s versus omega-6 very favorable, like quails, wild pigeons, partridges, ducks, rabbits, hares, wild boars, and thrushes. Something that is worth discussing also is the consumption of cheese. We've always had a certain proportion of pecorino cheese from the sheep, pecora in Italian is sheep, and the consumption of goat cheese. Especially in the past, the consumption of goat cheese was higher than nowadays. And it seems an important thing, especially if we say that the goat milk compared to cow has 13% more calcium, 25% more vitamin B6, 47% more vitamin A, and 134% more potassium, 3 times more niacin. And something which has been studied during this time that hasn't been published yet is that in the Barbagia Mountains grows a plant which is called dwarf curry that has an anti-inflammatory and anti-bactericidal effect. It seems that it is one of the most powerful ever found in nature. And it's interesting to notice that the goats are crackers, are crazy about it, and the sheep do not eat it. So something that has changed recently is the consumption of pecorino cheese and goat cheese in favor of the pecorino cheese. So it might be a hint, a clue. You might be wondering, yes, but I mean the pecorino cheese and generally the mature, the aged cheese, it's not considered to be healthy. But we have to add also that at that time we are talking about families who are very extremely poor. At that time, it could have been that the mature pecorino was left for the sale and for barter. It would have represented an income for the family. So generally they would have sold away the pecorino cheese who had a value and who have left for themselves the ricotta cheese, which is lighter than the cheese, because all the short chain saturated fats are trapped in the first cheese that you do, that is the proper mature pecorino cheese. Again, before I told you also, I told you about the consumption of barley when we talked about the positive correlations in that important study led by Professor Pes. And I told you also before that they established also a positive correlation between the consumption of red wine and longevity. This is true. Most of the centenarians used to drink a glass of wine a day. The drinking of the wine in our culture is quite something. You are urged by your father to drink even when you are 13 years old. But everything is moderate. It's really in our culture. It's like if it is part of the meal. It's part of the meal, and it helps in reinforcing the bonds in a way. If you are gathering with your family, you would drink few drops of wine. If you drink too much, you are not even considered by the society, because it's not considered to be appropriate to lose control. So, in a way, our centenarians have always consumed and drank a small amount of wine daily, and important works have found some interesting substances, like for instance David Sinclair, who published in Nature in 2003, found this substance which is called resveratrol. It's a lot of talk about this substance, which is an antioxidant, a very powerful antioxidant. And at the very beginning, he started with these researches, and he saw that it was capable in the laboratory to extend the life expectancy of the yeasts of the 70%. It was capable of extending and lengthening the life expectancy of the flies of the 30% and 30% in the worms. Even if there are a lot of controversies about it, because according to certain scientists, in order to obtain the same results, a man should have drank at least 150 liters of wine per day. So we're not quite sure about it, but it is worth mentioning. And again, the presence of the anthocyanidins, which in the past was known as vitamin P, and again, it's a powerful anti-inflammatory, was studied by Corder and again published in Nature in 2006. That group of researchers tasted 165 different wines, proving that the Cannonau grapes, which is an autochthonous variety present in Sardinia, has 10 times more anthocyanidins than the rest of the varieties. This is due because of the harsh conditions we have during summer. We are quite close to Africa. We are roughly 100 miles, we checked it before, away from Africa, and during summer, because of the sun, in a way the grapes have to produce a lot of antioxidants in order to protect themselves from the harsh conditions. And again, the presence of the important artery scrubbing flavonoids contained massively in the Cannonau grapes, which may help against cardiovascular disease. Unfortunately, all this, in a way, is coming to an end. So the blue zones, but not only the one in Sardinia, but even the other blue zones in the world, are disappearing. And we are interested in understand why. Things have changed dramatically in the blue zones of Sardinia since the 50s, with the arrival of the cars and with the changing of the lifestyle and the eating behaviors. So people is feeding on different foods, processed foods. And we are recording the same numbers as the rest of the world. When you talk about obesity, or people who's overweight, or metabolic diseases, or blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, we are tackling the same problems that you are having in a way. And this is why, in a way, this is because, in a way, our genes, it's like if they couldn't keep up, evolutionary speaking, with the modern times. We have changed just recently in a very dramatic way. And our genes and our metabolism couldn't adapt. I want to make an example. I mean, we've been around, if you want, for 4 million years, and we have been, for most of the time, hunter-gatherers, because the invention of agriculture was just 10,000 years ago, and the processed food arrived with the Industrial Revolution. So for 99.5% of our time, we were hunter-gatherers. That means that for 99.5% of our times, our genes developed under those circumstances. So 99.5% of our genes are forged by those habits. If we had to scale the entire evolutionary story of the human beings to fit into a single 24 hours, we would have been hunter-gatherers for 23 hours and 56 minutes. The invention of agriculture just happened during the last 4 minutes, and the processed food with the Industrial Revolution only during the last 7 seconds. Not to mention what happened in recent times when in certain countries after in the post-industrialized countries we have experienced again 50 years ago dramatic changes in our habits. So in a way the take-home message is this, that our genes and our metabolism, it is not ready and it hasn't been designed for that kind of abundance. Actually, abundance has never been a problem before the 50s. Abundance for the men has never been a problem. It's just a recent thing that happened from the 50s on. All these eating opportunities, the size of the portions, the consumption of the sugar. I mean, in the 18th century, the consumption of sugar was just 1 kilogram per person. In the 19th century, it was 6 kilograms. Nowadays, it's 70 kilograms. It's skyrocketed. This is just few examples, not to mention again those terrible refined flours with which we do a lot of terrible things. So we're not ready for that. Genetically, we are not ready for that abundance. We were mainly planned for scarcity. That's why it's so hard to lose weight. Because we haven't been designed for losing weight. In a way, we have been designed for gaining fat, which was precious, because generally we would have, after, for instance, a successful hunt, we would have feasted on the prey, and then for a while it was nothing. It was almost famine. So we would have needed those extra energies stored in the fat. But today, those restrictions are not coming anymore. Nobody told our genes that we can grocery shopping whenever we want. I mean, we are constantly on that phase of a successful hunt. So I think that in a way we should learn the lesson from the mice that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We should change approach with the food, and we should eat less. That's it. I mean, in a lot of cases, the scientists try to single out one aspect of the key factor, because it's more appealing, of course, to say it's the resveratrol. I found the fountain of the youth. The secret of longevity is that. It's less appealing, of course, to say it's hundreds of different factors that combined together may work, of course. But we are quite sure that nothing good comes from eating as much as we are doing.
All right, thank you. So Ivo has some pictures of some of the centenarians and some of the countryside. If you've got classes to go to, now would be a good time to leave, but if you can stick around, he's got some pictures he'd love to share with you, and if you have questions, then stick around and he'd be happy to answer your question.
Thank you. Thanks to you for coming.
Hey, thanks for sticking around. So like I said, some pictures. If you have questions, maybe you can raise your hand as we go along, or hang on to them, and when he's done presenting, he'll be happy to chat with you.
And don't forget, then we have to nibble at something.
That's right. Then we have the shepherd's bread and some fresh olive oil.
Do you think it's better to switch off the lights, or?
Oh yeah, that would be a good idea.
Like this?
Yeah. Perfect.
Unfortunately, most of these people passed away. This lady was 103 when I took the picture of her. Actually, this one was married with a lady who was 99. They were among the eldest in Italy at that time. I love this one because this one seems like a trunk of a tree. It's so impressive. So I took all these pictures using external lights. It was a choice, and that made the difference at least personally, because in order to have them used to it, I had to spend time with them. So I paid visits. So after a while, after a few days, I could work that way, using lights and equipment and things. But it was the only way I had to enhance, in a way, their wrinkles, who has a lot of stories to tell. The lady was 107. In Perdas de Vogo, it's very famous, that place, because the Melis family, she was the eldest of the family. The Melis family is known worldwide for being the most long-lived family, since they were 11 children. And 10 of them were something like 107, 103, 101, 99, 97. It was a lot of fun for me to interact with them, and we hired a library in their town hall. So all the relatives showed up, and we were something like 200 people, 200 relatives, with all these guys sitting next to each other, and also quarreling. Because, for instance, the lady of 107 was saying to them, "Oh, you don't understand nothing. You are too young." And that one was 1999. They kept, it's kind of like they kept the same relationship. It was a lot of fun. They were crazy. There's the lady. 103, still knitting. Smoothly. And look at something that is striking in the Sardinian women is their dignity. They are always straight, dressed properly. It's very characteristic. Bright eyes with a lot of something that I didn't mention before is that everyone that I interviewed, they were so strong. I mean, but I'm talking about strong personalities. Still, sometimes even a little bit overbearing, giving orders to the children, so attached with the life. I mean, they were alive because they wanted to live. They didn't just surrender to their ages. I think that that might be an important factor as well. The personality. 101. This is nice. The guy's 100, I think, when I took this one. Then he reached 103. And the other one is the son, who looks older than him. He was, I think it was 72 or something like that. This is just a small collection of pictures, and here I have brought some more pictures that I took in that area in order to add something to this talk for those who haven't been in Sardinia yet. We are 1.5 and something, and we have more than 3 million sheep. I love this one. They see balls here. He's dressed like me. I brought this one because this is a tradition. I can call it traditional dressing in the center of the island, made of velvet. And this is these are the mountains that I mentioned before. I mean, a barren and very severe environment. We have very interesting carnivals right now. No, really. Right now in February. And I'd like you to know that Sardinia was among one of the latest places in Europe to be Christianized. And when the church, at a certain point in the 5th century after Christ, in a way, succeed to Christianize the area, but it's something that, according to some, they have never managed to do, especially when it comes to talk about men. The men are not believers. Women, in the church you can see a lot of women, or only women, but because men are not believers. I'm not sure about the reasons. Anyway, the church arrived and started to call everything with saint something, or just changed the names of something that was much more ancient. So we have a lot of customs and celebrations which have very ancient roots, like the Barbagia carnivals in the villages of the blue zones. These are very archaic rituals which are still made in winter. Making cheese. Actually, the guy is smoking the cheese here. Just flipping it over. You remember when I told you that these communities were isolated, highly isolated. This road, you can understand why. This road was built in the 80s. And that road leads to Seulo, which is only 30 minutes away from my village, with which they have never interacted because it was not convenient to try to pass through this territory. That is the traditional boot of the shepherd. Now it has been artistically reused. And this is an ancient instrument that you can find only in Sardinia. We believe that it is older than 3,000 years. It's just a simple tribal wind-blown three-pipe instrument made with reeds or canes, I don't know. Okay. There's a very rural environment. It's an olive well of the previous civilization we had that was called Nuragic civilization, which is a unicum of Sardinia. It's in a way the first settlers, the native Sardinians, who started that civilization 2,000 years before Christ, dotting the island with these megalithic towers. And we are quite sure that our roots and most of the culture in the blue zones and in the whole Sardinia comes from the Nuragic civilization. They used to celebrate the cult of the waters, and this one, it's a holy well. That's an ancient train. It's still working. It takes 6 hours for making something like 100 kilometers, which is 70 miles. It works with the coal. It's a steam engine train, which is called a green train right now, but it pollutes a lot because of the emissions. This is nice because it's an old woman who's approaching modernity because she is separating. She's recycling. Unfortunately, in some villages, sometimes you just find old people around, and this is a very bad situation. It's quite sad because all the youngsters in small villages of Sardinia just fled away because of the lack of jobs. And so the elders gather all together. This is a very classic situation that you can find around. This is one of those nuragas that I mentioned before. The youngsters, smoking and drinking, as I told you before, habits are changing, but still dressed traditionally. A lot of houses in Sardinia are made with the adobes, with the unfired mud bricks that you can see in the background. This is a genius. This is my father, the one who does that soil that you're about to try that. And that's it. I'll leave my father.